Good morning, everybody. It's 10:03, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the South Atlantic LCC's Third Thursday Web Forum. This is our February edition. My name's Hillary Morris, and I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for your cooperative. So every month, your cooperative hosts this web forum featuring a presentation on current and ongoing work throughout the South Atlantic LCC. And as the name suggests, it happens every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m., and it serves as a great chance for you to ask questions, provide feedback that will help guide the future of the South Atlantic LCC. So every web forum has the same overall agenda. I'll start out by introducing our presenter, who will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and following the presentation, there'll be plenty of time for questions. And then we spend the rest of the webinar typically on updates from your cooperative, followed by an open discussion. Since we're covering staff updates in the main webinar today, we'll probably skip that. So before I hand things off to Rua, just the usual rundown of logistics. I'm going to mute everybody during the presentation just to minimize background noise. So if you have any questions, please type them directly into the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that, or you can just hold them until after the presentation. If you do use the chat box and you want everyone to be able to read the question during the discussion, remember to send the note to everyone using that drop-down menu in the chat. And to speak at any time, all you need to do is press *6 to unmute yourself. So before I mute everybody, does anyone want to speak up with a question, comment? All right.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So before I hand things off to Rua, I'll just go ahead and introduce him. You probably know him. He's our very own science coordinator here at the South Atlantic LCC. So continuing with our yearly revision cycle for the blueprint and the ecosystem indicators, Rua is going to update us on the progress that has been made so far toward Blueprint 2.1. So Blueprint 2.1 is a smaller data-driven update that uses very similar methods to Blueprint 2.0. It's just incorporating improved data on the freshwater, aquatic, pine and prairie, and marine ecosystem indicators. So we'll leave plenty of time for discussion and feedback on the results of the indicator testing and next steps toward developing version 2.1 of the Blueprint. So with that, Rua, I'm going to hand the presenter power off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Hillary. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
All right, good. Excellent. So I'm going to catch up on a few things here. First, let me go ahead, share this. That's interesting. Doesn't seem to want to let me share yet. There we go. All right. There we go. WebEx keeps changing its sharing. So today will be pretty fun. I'm going to be talking a little bit about improving the blueprint and moving on to version 2.1 and then a little bit beyond. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the indicators and testing, and then talk about some updates in the works for Blueprint 2.1, which we should have a draft around May and hope to have it final around June. And then a few fun things in development that aren't going to make it into this next update, but are more kind of future directions for the blueprint that it's been exploring. So first, on the indicators, a quick reminder of kind of these two types of indicators. They're around, on the natural side, we're talking about ecosystem integrity, usually about 3 indicators per ecosystem that are supposed to add up to the overall integrity of the system. And then on the cultural side, looking at these broader intact cultural landscapes and how history and people fit into the larger ecosystem. And we have these 3 types of indicator criteria, partly to help us select them in the beginning, but also so we can beat them up in testing and then fix them where they need to be fixed. So we have our ecological criteria, which is the classic no-brainers. Okay, they actually have to work as indicators of other things other than themselves. Our practical criteria, we've got to be able to model them and monitor them across a whole geography. And then the social criteria. And so whenever possible, if something's going to resonate with public and private land and water managers, with the broader American public, we should be erring on sides that resonate with folks. So those are the criteria, but the nice thing about those is they also provide us a foundation for how we can transparently test and improve the indicators over time. A lot of you have also seen this kind of lean startup diagram, so we tend to, as broader as a cooperative, move pretty fast on these updates, and so basically we are now up to a one-year revision cycle, especially getting even better about what months happen when. So, this is part of this one-year revision cycle where we test and improve the indicators, and then we take that information, fold it into an update to the blueprint, and then move on. So basically, we're on course to be doing these updates every year. So let me start with, I'm going to give you the broad summary of some of the improvements that happened in the indicator revision process that just finished off. So indicator models that we've improved. I've got a number of improvements in those models. Our riparian buffer indicator from the freshwater aquatic ecosystem will improve, and I'll show you some testing related to that. Our permeable surface indicator was now continuous instead of broad categories. We've made some improvements. I'll show you some testing on that one. In general, we're trying to move towards indicators that are, instead of just kind of a few categories of classes of kind of 1, 2, 3, we're trying to move towards more continuous measures because they work better in the overall blueprint prioritization. So we also have, there's been a recent update of the TNC resilient biodiversity hotspots, the data we use for that indicator, for the landscapes, which covers kind of all the terrestrial systems, particularly making some improvements in how it deals with wet pine ecosystems. So that's exciting, and we're folding in the latest of that in this next update to the blueprint. We've also got some better data on, for some of the pine and prairie birds, particularly filling in some gaps related to right-cockaded woodpeckers in that index. And then also got a star by the Marine Mammal Index, because this one is almost done but still in process, and I'll talk a little bit about that one as well. So some good improvements in the models. And we also have a few that were changed or added. So we've updated our fresh and saltwater connectivity indicator is now a migratory fish index. This was always kind of the intention of that measure, but we didn't quite have the data on migratory fish we needed to do that until fairly recently as part of the Southeast Aquatic Connectivity Assessment Project, CCAP. And we've also updated changed our resident fish index to move towards a term called network complexity. So this is actually used in some of the upcoming TNC freshwater resilience, and this is looking at the number of connected stream classes. So this works fairly well as an indicator of current condition, but also will help out into the future as we think about climate change adaptation in the aquatic systems. And then finally, we have a new indicator capturing aquatic diversity hotspots at the subwatershed level within our freshwater aquatics. So that was in all our testing. One of the key things, we were really not able with some of the condition index to track these key patterns in sort of endemism and diversity in the aquatic system. And so we have this new indicator to fill in that gaps. So lots of good improvements, and these improvements have been really guided by kind of your comments from the last indicators, but also in the last version of the blueprint. So, marine and particularly freshwater systems were the ones that needed the most work, and so they're the ones that got the most attention during the testing and revision process. So those are the changes, and now I'm going to go into some of the testing, because testing is fun. This has been particularly an adventure here. So here's one of the data sets we've been using for the aquatics. This is the EPA Rivers and Streams Assessment from 2008 and 2009. What was really nice about this, you can see the points, that black outline is the South Atlantic LCC boundaries there, and each of the points are sort of point level sampling where they recorded fish and benthic insect indices. And what was particularly nice about this is that we have consistent methodology across state lines, consistent classification, and it's randomized across the geography. So this is a pretty nice testing data set that we use in a few different ways. Here is showing the improved riparian indicator versus some of the benthic invertebrates. So what you have on the x-axis is the invertebrate score kind of poor, fair, good conditions. And then on the Y, that's the percent natural in the riparian area. So this is kind of the new indicator. And so it's performing relatively well. This is based on 111 non-urban sampling points from the area. We decided we really wanted to focus it on the non-urban areas because that's where things like permeable surface and the other metrics weren't there to help. And so the riparian, those rural areas were particularly important to capture well in the with that riparian buffer. So, obviously not perfect. It's only one of the indicators, but it was tending to capture it fairly well, especially when you compare it with our previous riparian indicator, which is shown on the left, and it was pretty much not working at all. So this was just a 30-meter buffer based on some older land cover data around the streams instead of accounting for difference in floodplain size and a few other things. So pretty clear based on the testing. The last version didn't work. This new version shown on the right works a heck of a lot better. So that was encouraging to see. So that is the riparian indicator. Now I'm going to show you some of the results from the network complexity versus the fish indices in that same survey. So that network complexity, number of connected stream classes. And so now on the x-axis at the bottom, we've got the sort of fish indices, and you've got the same poor, fair, good conditions. So in this case, at least in differentiating the good from the poor and the fair, it's working fairly well. So this is 168 of the sampling points that we used in that analysis. And what was particularly interesting on the aquatics is that we put these in kind of linear models all together because they're supposed to be used together, complementary. And what we were finding is that each of these different indicators I'm talking about were capturing a different component. So the riparian buffers didn't do so well with the fish side of things, but network complexity worked well. The network complexity didn't work as well with the benthic insects, but the riparian buffer captured that well. So they are seeming to behave as we'd hope as indicators, not just in isolation, but collectively capturing different components of the system, which is what you hope to see. So one other data set we used was for some further testing of the permeable surface. So we pulled some data, in this case from North Carolina, looking at water quality sampling from almost 3,000 water bodies. There's pretty extensive testing up here in North Carolina. Data from 2006 to 2010, and this is looking at sort of supporting versus not supporting aquatic uses. A lot of that was driven by some of the components that we didn't capture in the other testing, which was things like contaminants, harmful bacteria, and some of those other components that weren't as well captured. And so what we were looking for, and part of the discussion, I don't think anyone on the call was part of some of the freshwater indicator revisions, was this sort of question about the kind of 10% threshold, and do we want to accentuate that sort of threshold in as far as permeable surface versus the others. And so we kind of went and plotted our permeable surface based on those data. And so this is permeable surface versus water quality at the catchment level. And now on the bottom there, on the X, you see that's permeable surface summarized by the catchment, and then probability of meeting the North Carolina water quality standards. So one thing you may notice immediately, we're using permeable surface instead of impervious surface. This is a weird, it's kind of the one exception to the rule. We're trying to make all the indicators mean good, more is better. And so in this case, we needed to switch impervious to permeable surface. So the mental translation, 90% permeable surface is the same as 10% impervious. But what we did find is that, looking throughout the North Carolina area, there was this sort of more straightforward decaying function of, more permeable surface is better, but there weren't any magical thresholds around that sort of 10% change point that showed the big changes. And so we followed up a little bit more into the literature and looked into this. And this is actually that pattern that we're finding in this testing is very consistent with what folks have found more recently in kind of analyzing impervious surface thresholds, that there is not, it looks like this. And so that was good to see, both this in the testing, but also that echoed in the literature of what people have been finding more recently about impervious surface relationships. So this indicator seems to be working as well. One of the things in progress we're getting very close on is improving our marine mammal index. And so what you'll see on the left, our last index was based really on sightings per unit effort, had a lot of gaps as far as the data, and where we just didn't actually have enough sampling effort because it was based on shipboard surveys. So as you can see, fairly large chunks. There are holes in the data. So that was a particular challenge before. And what we're moving towards is some new models coming out of Duke that are taking all the different survey effort that's going on and turning them more into probabilistic models. So what you see on the right is actually looking at species richness year-round. That's the one on the top there of marine mammals, and there's one on abundance. So they have it individually for each species by month, I think by season. And so we're moving towards a little bit more refined kind of predictive model kind of approach of density versus this sort of coarser sightings per unit effort. So we're expecting some big improvements in the marine side as well. So we've had a few discussions in the marine team. We're just waiting on some final data. All right, so that is a whirlwind introduction to the updates of the indicators so far in this process. And before I move on to some other improvements for Blueprint 2.1, I just wanted to stop real quick and see if anybody had any questions so far.
Just remember *6 to unmute.
All right, excellent. Just giving you a break in case there was something you were like, oh, I got to ask this question, but I'm going to forget. Now, improvements to Blueprint 2.1. So already, all the different indicator improvements I just talked about are going to be improving Blueprint 2.1 just as is. That's part of it. It's an indicator-driven prioritization. So, you know, the better the data and indicators are coming in, the better the results are going to be. We also have a few more other targeted improvements that we're going to tweak in this data-driven update. Oops. So those are improving the aquatic and terrestrial integration. That was an issue. These are basically coming from the reviews that some of you were sort of part of after Blueprint 2.0 came out, the final version, or particularly some of the things as you were in the workshops, Blueprint workshops, and you were circling particular places or bringing up particular issues where things were breaking down. Those have been the highest priority for improving in Blueprint 2.1. So one is the aquatic and terrestrial integration and how we brought in the aquatic priorities. So we got beyond just the improvements in the indicators, some potential things I'll talk about on the aquatic and terrestrial. Improving the corridor routing, especially near urban areas. As things got closer to the urban areas, corridors just didn't quite make as much sense. And another issue, and I'm going to be going over each of these, was we had this kind of other ecosystem class that didn't fit into any categories, and it was particularly problematic in some sections of eastern North Carolina. So we're working on filling that in. And then also improving the marine priorities. That's still in the works. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about that, but I will talk about the other three. But before I do, there's one concept that I wanted to get across because it's important for a few of these improvements, which is this idea of the active river area. So this is essentially trying to get at all these different components that are kind of actively involved in the river itself. So material contribution areas, things that are bringing in sediment, those upland slopes that are sort of near the river, that sort of meander belt of where the rivers are going, the floodplains, riparian wetlands, the sort of that broader active area. And so this is kind of the equivalent to that 100-year floodplain from the core, only we don't actually have 100-year floodplains defined for the whole geography everywhere. But this kind of gets at that. Before, we didn't really have a good layer for where this active river area was in Blueprint 2.0, and so now we have a layer, so we're starting to use it in indicators and potentially using it in this next version of the Blueprint as well. So that is a key concept. So aquatic and terrestrial integration. So on the left, when we were using our sort of aquatic indicators, they were applying in Blueprint 2 to pretty much the whole watershed. So, sort of your riparian buffer condition, your impervious, a lot of your stuff was covering this whole broader area. So you see that's kind of Huck 12, that blue is like whatever was going on within the streams was pretty much applying to the whole area. That was pretty important because essentially what it was saying is that, even whether you're in right up against the river or you were way far away up in an uplands, you had an equal kind of priority as far as how you contributed to the aquatic systems. So that was Blueprint 2.0, and now we're working on moving towards using the active river area itself. So, by the way, we're in the sort of Big Bend, Florida here, down on the Gulf Coast, and so that blue is now showing your sort of active river area. So we're working on using that more formally in some of this analysis and contributing. Those are the strongest contributions to the aquatics. And what you'll immediately see is as you get closer to the coast, of course, you have these bigger floodplains, and that has a little bit less of an impact on the priorities. But as you start moving upstream, especially as you get closer in the Piedmont, the active river areas become a lot smaller and thinner. And so one thing in the works for the integration. Another component we're working on is routing of the corridors, especially near urban areas. So here's this sort of nice conceptual transect going from sort of the natural zone into the urban core that I always use when I start thinking about as we get closer to urban. And so if you think about it, the approaches to corridors and methods and opportunities are a little bit different as you go from left to right, as you go from the sort of natural zone and then into rural areas with more working land, and then you start moving into the suburbs and the cities. Things are a little bit different as far as what these areas can contribute to the overall ecosystem and where the opportunities are for corridors and connectivity. So what we're looking at is potentially starting to rely more heavily on water supply and trails and greenways as you start getting into the urban areas. So thinking about different connectivity rules in urban. And what you're seeing on the right here is based on areas that are defined, quote-unquote, as urban by the Census Bureau, which tend to track fairly well with this kind of pattern of where some of these connectivity rules start breaking down. So we're looking at some different options about kind of lowering corridor resistance in these active river areas and floodplains and along trails and greenways, these places where, from a water perspective, the urban areas can contribute to areas downstream, but also where corridors are a little bit more realistic. So that's something that's in the works, in progress. And I'll show you some of the validation stuff we've been doing. We've been grabbing water supply and trails data from a number of municipalities throughout the LCC geography, and actually working on getting a hold of a really nice trails layer that will cover the whole geography. Fingers crossed. So here's an example in Charlotte. This is Charlotte, North Carolina. We're centered on Charlotte here. The black are showing the current greenways out in Charlotte. And now when you overlay the active river area, you can see a pretty, not surprisingly, pretty strong connection between where these trails and greenways are going and where the active river areas are. It's not always this perfect, especially when you have rails to trails and other connections, but that's why we're working on a few other components. All right. the other ecosystem class. Now, so this is a category, like I mentioned, didn't easily fit into any of the ecosystems based on the current GIS models. So a reminder, regardless of how impacted you are, if you're an urban area, if you're kind of a downtown Atlanta, we're still assigning you to whatever the ecosystem category would be if you weren't downtown. So what would be under that skyscraper? Often it's kind of upland hardwood systems. But based on the models we had for ecosystem masks, there were a few places that just didn't fit the rules. And as you can kind of see in this picture here, really the biggest problems were in this section of eastern North Carolina. Had a few issues in some estuarine classification, so you see some black up in Winya Bay down in South Carolina, but this was mostly an eastern North Carolina thing. Probably didn't see it unless you were working there. And these tended to mostly be drained agriculture and kind of dirt roads near coastal North Carolina. And I'll show you, here's an aerial photo zooming in on one of those blobs. This is an area that, in theory would have been forested wetlands, probably mostly Pocosin, but is now kind of drained and diked and fairly dry and sandy. So those are some areas that we are now working on filling in so we don't have this mysterious other class. So the current plan is to use land fire, their biophysical settings, and so far in some initial investigations when we looked at those have been pretty reasonable, and some folks that have reviewed it so far. That is the plan for other. All right, so that's some of the stuff in progress for Blueprint 2.1. And so, again, we're shooting to have a final version in June, should have some drafts out May or before for looking at this sort of more data-driven, smaller update. But there's some other really cool things in the works that aren't really going to make it into version 2.1, but will likely make it into some future iterations. So, before I talk about that, though, I want to take another break and see if anybody has any questions.
Actually, we have a question on the chat box from Mike Wright. Do we have access to the data that is used to develop these models? And I'm pretty sure he was talking about active river area. If so, where do we go to obtain the data? This would be useful for Department of Defense entities conducting NEPA reviews and integrated natural resources management plan updates.
That is perfect. And in fact, what I will do, and let me see if I can, I'm just sharing since I've got a little bit of time here, I'm going to go and just share my desktop. We can send out this link here, share my screen. Okay, now I'm sharing my whole screen here. Let me go down and we'll answer that question directly here. So what we have, so this is, I'm going to go to the Conservation Planning Atlas here. So in the Planning Atlas, what we do is we have, so for example, from Blueprint 2.0, you can see right on the right, access Blueprint 2.0 data. So for all of these different pieces, and one thing I don't think we have the active river area up just yet, but that's what we're gonna be putting that one up soon as well. For all of these pieces, we have essentially the sort of blueprint itself, and we have all the individual components. So his is from 2.0. This has all the indicator layers from version 2.0 for beaches, estuaries, freshwater, aquatic, and then the intermediary pieces, so the priorities, the corridors, ecosystem scores. So we put those all up so you can go ahead and download. So here's forested wetlands. Then you can drill into any one of them. Here's forested wetland indicator birds. You can download that stuff directly. External source data, all the metadata will come with it. And also, we have this kind of description that has all the input data and all the mapping steps. So if you need any information about where stuff came from, literature and all that, that's all there. And we just recently have it set up, which is fairly nice, for when you want to download for, say, the indicator data, instead of having to go indicator by indicator by indicator, when you download this, you get it in a geodatabase, and so it'll have all the indicator data in the geodatabase, so you don't have to go one by one. It's all there in one single layer. So yeah, you can access that stuff. And what we're going to have, we already have a layer for Blueprint 2.1, a gallery. So if you go right here to the front page, Blueprint 2.1 data, this has so far the indicators for Blueprint 2.1. So the ones I talked about in the freshwater aquatic, the new riparian, all of those are here. We'll double check to see if we have the active river area. I think we have NHD. We'll put that in the additional data because that was one of the things on our list to get in there.
Sounds good. Thanks, Rua.
Yep. So all this stuff is accessible. We try to do the classic sort of layer cake. You can access it at different layers, and if you want to go all the way down to the gory details, you should be able to. All right. And if you have trouble finding it, just feel free to email me or Hillary or someone else, and we'll help point it out to you. All right, back to this. Yeah, the goal with any of these and the blueprint itself is we want to make sure that, you know, if you're a detail person and you want to use individual components or pieces, you know, we're trying to set it up so you could theoretically, if you had the time and inclination, you could completely recreate the blueprint from the raw data layers. All right. Any other questions? Anything else in the chat box before we move on to some kind of future cool things? All right. Here, nothing. We'll talk about beyond 2.1. So, development number one we've been looking into is looking at this question of restoration over time. So here's an example of some of the methods in zonation, which is what we're using for the blueprint. This is kind of an image from some work back in 2009 looking at restoration schedule for Southeast Australia. And what's pretty exciting about this whole question is that they're taking into account things like, you know, different forests are going to grow at different rates and are going to have different benefits for the indicators that they looked at. And so how do you, over time, plan your sort of restoration schedule to make sure that at all different points you have sufficient habitat for the species that are there? And so some of these methods, I think, are particularly relevant for questions about longleaf restoration. You know, we have that sort of central question about how much and where do we need to do in restoration in restoring new longleaf areas and sort of building up new places, you know, typically converted ag, versus how much of our effort should we be spending and where, as far as just kind of getting existing pine stands in better condition, because, you know, it takes quite a long time to get that, to grow that longleaf out and get it in a good condition. So working on some methods to help look at some of those questions and make sure, help look at that portfolio about where and when might be the best to restore different, you know, to be doing restoration from the very bottom from scratch versus kind of improving the conditions of current stands. These methods also could be helpful in answering some questions about how do we make sure there's enough early successional habitat over time across the landscape for species that depend on that, and also for more dynamic marine communities. There's also some applications. So very cool methods and some stuff already starting to look into for restoration over time. Continuing the time theme, which is going to be a big one in a lot of these updates, is some improved sea level rise migration corridors. So here's just an image showing marsh migration near Charleston and Savannah. And so we got some sort of basic ways of dealing with incorporating migration corridors and sort of resilience into the analysis now. But improving how we look at those stepping stones about the places that are going to get us from one place to another, and looking at where those choke points are in things like marsh migration and migration for different ecosystems. So we've got some methods we're looking into that will help with these sort of migration corridors approaches, especially when there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly where and when those corridors will kind of open up and change different ecosystems. And And another thing in the works is looking at monthly dynamics in marine priorities. So particularly run into this in the marine system, where a lot of the marine uses and what happens in the marine system is very seasonal and sort of seasonally dependent about sort of different actions in the marine environment. And so have some things in the works where we might be able to bring in more of the monthly dynamics about marine priorities. So here's your sort of example of right whale migration, and the sort of they're in their fall and wintering grounds down here in the South Atlantic, but are feeding up north. So bringing in some of that sort of time dependence of making sure that you're capturing key places for these different indicators, but also at the times when it's most relevant. That's fairly neat. And then finally, a couple of things in the works for dealing with downstream impacts. So this is that classic situation where you're going to want to prioritize action in one place, maybe farther upstream, but you're really going for benefits farther downstream. So we've got some projects in the works coupling some of the coastal actions and marine impact models, which will help a lot in sort of identifying those places that can benefit the marine ecosystems, both near shore and farther offshore. But also we've got some improved methods we're working on for the optimization, where we can essentially prioritize areas in one place specifically because of their downstream impacts in another place. So that's also in the works. Those are a few of the things been working on. Won't really make it into Blueprint 2.1 in a few months, but are likely to make it into future versions of the Blueprint and are under investigation right now. And that is all I have on the sort of indicator update, Blueprint 2.1, and then some future directions. So with that, questions?
Star 6 to unmute. Don't be shy.
Hi, I have a question regarding scale when we're looking at these projects. Is this more applicable to making decisions at the grander scale, at a regional scale or national scale, versus at a site-specific scale, just based on the data that's being used to develop these models?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. There's a certain level, especially as you get closer to the site level scale, because these are right now at 200 meter pixels, to try to represent the sort of level of resolution of the data we're using. Some of them are finer and more applicable at the finer scales, and it's getting a little closer at that time. But really, a lot of the ways I think we're not talking about something that's going to be perfect in discriminating one parcel versus another parcel. At this point, especially with that sort of big 200 meter blocks right now. As you get a little bit higher, get above the parcel, it's the kind of thing that can be helpful as a complement to other layers. Obviously, especially as you get down finer in scale, you wouldn't want to only use the Blueprint for those things. And as you get into broader scales, as you move up to the watershed level and above, then the models and the indicators, I think, are a little bit more and more informative. So that's about where the scale is at right now. One of the things that I didn't mention that's in the works, because I could only mention so many things, is not for 2.1, but I would expect probably in the version after to start seeing the resolution of the Blueprint become finer. So, more down to 120 or 90 or a little bit higher resolution pixels, which is more to represent the fact that the data going in is getting a little bit better and more refined and more spatially appropriate to use it at finer scales. So, does that
Yep.
answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions or thoughts? They can be broad or particularly crazy, nerdy technical questions. I like either one. All right. Well, sounds like we're pretty good on the question front. And I know most of y'all, but if not, you can feel free if you've got something that's right after you hang up and you're like, oh, I got this burning question, or I'm really curious about this. Just send me an email, give me a call. Glad to talk.
We'd be happy to hear from you for sure. I'll give just a quick preview of next month's webinar before we let y'all go. The next one's going to be March 17th, same time, same place, right here at 10 a.m., and we'll be hearing from Dr. Ron Sutherland, who's a conservation scientist with Wildlands Network. So he's going to be talking about a project that he did, partially funded by the South Atlantic LCC, on terrestrial habitat connectivity. So improving habitat connectivity continues to be a really well-supported method of promoting climate change adaptation for wildlife. So this is a multi-year habitat connectivity modeling exercise that Wildlands Network undertook in 2011 in collaboration with Clemson University. They were using the Clemson supercomputer to get actually 90-meter spatial resolution across a broad buffer of the South Atlantic LCC region. And the goal was to prioritize wildlife corridors for 7 species: black bears, red wolves, Florida panthers, diamondback rattlesnakes, timber rattlesnakes, pine snakes, and box turtles. So they took 2 different modeling approaches using CircuitScape and the Connectivity Analysis Toolkit to give a really complex picture of the current state of functional habitat connectivity across the South Atlantic. And they were also using projections of urbanization and sea level rise to predict future levels of habitat connectivity all the way out to the year 2100. So in this webinar, Ron's going to be presenting the final results from this project and highlighting their key findings in terms of priority areas and future research needs. So this should be a really, really good talk. We'd love to have you back next month. And I always like to end on just making sure folks know how to get involved in the cooperative. I did see some names I didn't recognize on the participant list today, which is awesome. So if this is the type of thing you're interested in, please join our website. That's a great way to get involved. You'll get our monthly newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this webinar. So with that, I'll open the floor for any additional questions anyone might have before we sign off. If you had one of those burning realizations that Rua mentioned, don't be shy. *6 to unmute. All right, well, not hearing any, I will let y'all go. Thanks so much for joining us. We're 15 minutes early, and appreciate you presenting, Rua, and hope to see you all in March.
Bye, everybody.